At 2:30 in the morning, not from the Oval Office, not in a primetime address to the nation, but in an 8-minute video posted to Truth Social, the President of the United States told the world that America was now at war with Iran. By sunrise, over 1,000 targets inside Iran had been struck. By nightfall, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was dead. 6 American service members had been killed in Kuwait. 18 more were wounded. And in the halls of Congress, a constitutional firestorm was erupting that could reshape the balance of power between the White House and Capitol Hill for generations to come. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. This is Operation Epic Fury. And tonight, we break down everything you need to know. Welcome back to the channel. If you are watching this for the first time, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell because we cover the stories that actually matter, the ones that don't get simplified into talking points, the ones where the facts are complex, the stakes are enormous, and the truth requires more than a 60-second clip. Tonight is one of those nights. What we are covering this evening is not just breaking news. It is the kind of story that historians will be writing about for decades. It involves war, constitutional law, presidential authority, the survival of a nuclear-armed theocracy, the lives of American soldiers, and a Congress that is deeply, bitterly divided about what to do next. So take a breath, settle in, and let's go through this step by step. Let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence of events here is critical to understanding everything that follows. In the early hours of Saturday, February 28, 2026, the United States military and the Israeli Defense Forces launched a massive, coordinated joint military campaign against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The operation was codenamed Operation Epic Fury by the United States Department of Defense and Operation Roaring Lion by Israel. This was not a targeted missile strike against 1 or 2 facilities. This was a full-spectrum military assault on a sovereign nation. According to U.S. Central Command, in just the first 12 hours alone, over 900 strikes were carried out against Iranian targets. The Israeli military confirmed that 200 of its fighter jets struck nearly 500 targets inside Iran on the very first day of the operation. Let that sink in. 900 American strikes and 500 Israeli strikes, all within the first half day of combat. Now, what were the targets? According to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Michael Waltz, who addressed the UN Security Council during the initial hours of the operation, the stated U.S. military objectives in Operation Epic Fury included dismantling Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, interfering with Iran's ability to arm its regional proxy forces, degrading Iran's naval assets that had been used to destabilize international shipping lanes, and ensuring that Iran could never obtain or deploy a nuclear weapon. These are sweeping, ambitious objectives. This was not a one-night raid. This was the opening of what President Trump himself described as a campaign that could last several weeks. The assets deployed in this operation were staggering in their scale and sophistication. According to a fact sheet released by U.S. Central Command, the strikes involved B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, the most advanced strategic bombers in the world, Army PAC-3 interceptor missile systems, Lucas drones, THAAD anti-ballistic missile systems, F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters, Air Force A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, Navy EA-18G Growler electronic attack aircraft, airborne early warning and control systems, P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft, MQ-9 Reaper drones, M142 HIMARS rocket artillery systems, counter-drone systems, and a full array of FA-18EF Super Hornets, F-16 Fighting Falcons, and F-22 Raptors. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which had been deployed to the Middle East in early February as pressure on Tehran was escalating, played a central role in the operation alongside the USS Abraham Lincoln. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, in a post on social media platform X, called Operation Epic Fury the most lethal, most complex, and most precision aerial operation in history. Those are not small words. That is the sitting Secretary of Defense describing what he characterized as an unprecedented military achievement. He said, and we quote in paraphrase, "The Iranian regime had their chance to make a deal, refused, and is now suffering the consequences." He also stated that the Defense Department would not tolerate powerful missiles targeting American people, and that the operation would destroy Iran's missiles, missile production facilities, and its entire naval fleet. Now, let's talk about the most stunning single development in this entire operation, because it is the one that changes the geopolitical map of the Middle East more than anything else. At some point during the initial strikes on February 28th, a strike hit the compound of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, in Tehran. President Trump announced on Truth Social that Khamenei had been killed in the strike. The semi-official Iranian news agency Fars, which is linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, reported that Khamenei's daughter, son-in-law, grandchild, and a daughter-in-law were all killed in the strikes as well. Iran's government did not immediately confirm the supreme leader's death, with some sources initially appearing to deny it, but subsequent reporting from multiple outlets including NBC News, CBS News, Reuters, and Al Jazeera all pointed to the confirmation of Khamenei's death.
On March 1st, Iranian state media also confirmed the deaths of Chief of Staff Abdolrahim Mousavi and former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in separate strikes. CBS News reported that an intelligence source and a military source told them that 40 Iranian officials had been killed in the strikes, though it was not clear whether those officials were in one location or multiple locations.
Let us now address the Iranian response, because what Tehran did next matters enormously for understanding the full scope of this conflict. Iran's retaliation was swift, wide, and dangerous. Iran launched what it designated as Operation True Promise 4, a large-scale retaliatory missile and drone campaign that hit not just Israel, but U.S. military targets and civilian infrastructure across the Middle East. According to the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, during just the first day of retaliation, Iran launched roughly 420 missiles and drones across 9 countries and against ships at sea. Breaking that down, approximately 39% of those, or 162 missiles, were fired at Israel. 40%, 167 missiles, were targeted at the United Arab Emirates. 11%, 46 missiles, hit Qatar. Iranian strikes also targeted U.S. military assets in Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. The human toll from Iran's retaliatory campaign was significant and, in some cases, heartbreaking. In Israel, at least 8 people were killed in a missile strike on the city of Beit Shemesh, near Jerusalem. In Dubai, an Iranian strike targeted the Dubai airport, injuring 4 airport employees. Another attack struck the Fairmont Palm Hotel in Dubai. Drone debris caused a fire at the iconic Burj Al Arab Hotel on the Palm Jumeirah man-made island. At the Jebel Ali port, one of the busiest commercial ports in the world, debris from an interception caused a fire, though there were no reported casualties. Iran also expanded its strikes to Oman, which had been attempting to mediate between Washington and Tehran before hostilities began, targeting Oman's primary port and injuring a dock worker. According to various Gulf state defense ministries, at least 282 Iranian missiles and 833 drones were intercepted by Kuwaiti, Qatari, Bahraini, and Emirati air defense forces. The most devastating blow to American forces came at the Shuaibah port in Kuwait. According to CNN, which cited a source familiar with the situation, the first U.S. service members to die in this conflict were killed by a direct Iranian strike on a makeshift tactical operations center at that civilian port. Defense Secretary Hegseth described what happened at the press briefing on Monday. The strike that killed the service members hit what he called a tactical operations center that was fortified, but one Iranian projectile, what he described in military terminology as a squirter, made it through the air defense umbrella and struck that operations center directly. By Monday, March 2nd, U.S. Central Command had confirmed that 6 American service members had been killed in action and 18 had been seriously wounded throughout the operation. President Trump, in a video posted to Truth Social on Sunday night, acknowledged the casualties and said with grim candor, and we paraphrase, "We pray for the fallen, and sadly, there will likely be more before this ends. That's the way it is. Combat operations will continue until all objectives are achieved." Now let us turn to the constitutional and political firestorm that is raging in Washington, D.C., simultaneously with the military conflict in the Middle East, because this dimension of the story is arguably just as consequential in the long run. The central question is deceptively simple. Did the President of the United States have the legal and constitutional authority to launch this war without asking Congress for a declaration of war, or even a formal authorization for the use of military force? The answer to that question is not simple at all, and it has torn Washington along party lines, and even within parties. The United States Constitution is explicit on this point. Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress, not the President, the power to declare war. The President serves as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, but historically, the framers of the Constitution intended for the decision to go to war to rest with the legislative branch as the body most directly accountable to the American people. In practice, however, this constitutional provision has been stretched, reinterpreted, and in many critics' view, effectively hollowed out over the last several decades. Presidents of both parties, Democratic and Republican, have ordered military strikes, sustained military campaigns, and even long-term armed engagements without a formal declaration of war from Congress. The last time the United States formally declared war was during World War II. To address this erosion of congressional war authority, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, overriding President Nixon's veto. That resolution requires the president to report to Congress within 48 hours of introducing armed forces into hostilities, and in the absence of a congressional declaration of war, to terminate the use of U.S. armed forces within 60 days unless Congress authorizes the action. Presidents of both parties have largely treated this resolution as advisory rather than legally binding, and courts have been reluctant to adjudicate the matter, leaving the constitutional standoff unresolved for over 50 years. With that legal context in mind, let's look at how President Trump announced this war. He did not address the nation from the Oval Office. He did not call a joint session of Congress. He did not seek or obtain a formal authorization for the use of military force. He posted an 8-minute video to Truth Social at 2:30 in the morning Eastern Standard Time on Saturday, February 28th. According to reporting from the state's newsroom and other outlets prior to the attacks, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had notified both Democratic and Republican congressional leaders, the Gang of Eight, shortly before the strikes commenced. That notification to 8 congressional leaders just before bombs started falling was the full extent of advance congressional consultation. Republicans in Congress largely stood behind the president. Senate Majority Leader John Thune issued a statement praising Trump's decision, saying that despite the administration's dogged diplomatic efforts, the Iranian regime had refused every peaceful off-ramp. He said he commended President Trump for taking action to thwart these threats. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who confirmed he had been kept informed about the looming strikes throughout the week leading up to the operation, defended Trump's actions in strong terms at a press conference on Monday after he and other congressional leaders received a classified briefing from Secretary of State Rubio, Defense Secretary Hegseth, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane. Johnson told reporters at that briefing, and again we paraphrase here, that because Israel was determined to act with or without the United States, the commander-in-chief and the administration faced a very difficult decision to make. He described the operation as limited in scope, limited in its objective, and absolutely necessary for America's defense. He said he believes the operation will be wound up quickly. Secretary of State Rubio, going into that Monday briefing, told reporters that there was an imminent threat to the United States because the U.S. knew that Israel planned to attack Iran and expected Iran to retaliate by attacking American forces. Republican lawmakers latched onto that framing, that the imminent threat of Iranian retaliation against U.S. forces, once Israel acted, justified the president's authority as commander-in-chief to preemptively join Israel's campaign. Senate Foreign Relations Committee members in the Republican caucus echoed similar arguments throughout the weekend, pointing to Iran's 47-year history of hostility toward the United States, its support for militant proxies, its development of ballistic missiles capable of reaching American allies and bases, and its long-running nuclear ambitions. But not all Republicans fell in line. And this is where the story gets deeply interesting, because the opposition to Trump's decision to bypass Congress was bipartisan. Small in numbers, but significant in principle. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, a longtime libertarian-leaning critic of executive overreach in military affairs, was one of the most prominent Republican voices opposing the strikes on constitutional grounds. Paul has historically been consistent in insisting that Congress must authorize any military conflict regardless of which party controls the White House. In the House, Representative Thomas Massie, also of Kentucky and also a Republican, went further. He co-authored a War Powers Resolution with Democratic Representative Ro-Khanna of California, even before the overnight attack began. Massie called the strikes acts of war unauthorized by Congress. Representative Warren Davidson of Ohio expressed skepticism about the war powers resolution process as well, though his position was more nuanced. On the Democratic side, the response was largely, but not unanimously, one of outrage over the constitutional bypass, even as most Democrats condemned Iran's record and its nuclear program. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries of New York issued a lengthy statement questioning why Trump felt the need to carry out new military strikes when he had previously declared, after his June 2025 strikes, that Iran's nuclear program had been completely and totally obliterated. Jeffries said Democrats would force a vote on the Massie-Khanna war powers resolution when Congress returned to Washington. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont was characteristically blunt, calling the strikes unconstitutional and warning against another endless war in the Middle East. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland accused the president of lying to the American people while launching what he described as an illegal regime change war. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey demanded that Congress reassemble immediately that same weekend to vote on the war powers resolution, calling Trump's action appalling. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, who had been working with Senator Rand Paul to craft a war powers resolution on Iran, called for the Senate to immediately vote on it. Representative Ro Khanna, who co-authored the House version with Thomas Massie, appeared on NBC's Meet the Press on March 1st and said, and this is important, that the point of the resolution is to say Congress should at minimum weigh in on whether America wants another war in the Middle East. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, who sits on the Intelligence Committee, pointed to what he described as a week of shifting justifications from the Trump administration for attacking Iran, first destroying its nuclear program, then ending ballistic missile development, then regime change, and then sinking its naval fleet. Warner said he stands firmly with Israel, but that when American soldiers are being put in harm's way and Americans are being killed, there needs to be proof of an imminent threat to American interests, and he said he did not believe that standard had been met. By Monday night, March 2nd, as the classified briefings wrapped up on Capitol Hill, the picture was becoming clear. The House and Senate would vote on war powers resolutions as early as Wednesday, March 4th. But here is the cold political math of the situation, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about how this is likely to play out legislatively. Trump's Republicans hold slim but real majorities in both the House and the Senate. Even with a handful of Republicans like Paul and Massie joining Democrats in supporting the war powers resolutions, the numbers simply are not there in either chamber to pass such a resolution, let alone to override what would certainly be a presidential veto. And here is the historical fact that underscores how slim the odds truly are. No war powers resolution veto has ever been overridden in the history of the United States. Not once. Which brings us to the broader strategic and geopolitical picture. What exactly has Operation Epic Fury accomplished? What are its stated and unstated objectives, and what are the risks of further escalation? Let's break this down clearly. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which published an analysis within hours of the operation beginning, the strikes between Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion differ drastically from the previous Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025. That earlier operation consisted of limited strikes against key nuclear targets. This time, the United States and Israel are conducting what appears to be an attempt at comprehensive regime decapitation and military degradation on a scale that goes far beyond nuclear non-proliferation. The assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei is in a category by itself. Khamenei had led the Islamic Republic since 1989, nearly 4 decades. His death creates an enormous power vacuum inside Iran at the exact moment when the country's military is fighting a multi-front war. Its air defenses are being systematically dismantled, and its government and military command structure are under sustained attack. Iranian state media has reported that the military has lost control over several units that are now operating according to old standing orders with no updated command. This is a sign of chaos and institutional breakdown at the highest levels of Iranian military authority. On the nuclear question specifically, the CSIS analysis raises a particularly alarming issue: the Bushehr nuclear reactor. Russia's state atomic energy corporation Rosatom evacuated nearly 100 of its staff from Iran after the strikes began, though some personnel remained on site to keep the reactor operational. Any direct strikes on that reactor would carry severe radiological risks, potentially contaminating large areas of the Persian Gulf region, and would also create a serious diplomatic crisis with Moscow if Russian personnel were killed. Whether dismantling or destroying the reactor is a U.S. or Israeli objective remains publicly unclear, but the presence of that reactor in a war zone represents one of the most dangerous single variables in this entire conflict. Meanwhile, just days before the strikes began, there had been what appeared to be a genuine breakthrough in diplomacy. On February 27, 2026, just one day before Operation Epic Fury launched, Oman's foreign minister Badr al-Busaidi announced that a breakthrough had been reached in negotiations and that Iran had agreed both to never stockpile enriched uranium and to full verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Furthermore, Iran had reportedly agreed to irreversibly downgrade its current enriched uranium stockpile to the lowest level possible. The Omani foreign minister said peace was within reach. Less than 24 hours later, the bombs fell. That diplomatic development, and its apparent abandonment, is something that Democrats like Senator Warner have seized on as evidence that the administration's real goal is regime change, not nuclear nonproliferation. The international reaction to Operation Epic Fury has been sharply divided along lines that largely reflect global power politics. North Korea's foreign ministry denounced the attacks as a thoroughly illegal act of aggression, accusing the United States and Israel of shameless and gangster-like conduct. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar condemned the attack and called for an immediate halt to escalation, even as Pakistani Shiite Muslims took to the streets in Lahore to protest. Russia, through its defense of the Bushehr reactor and the evacuation of Rosatom staff, signaled its displeasure without explicitly condemning the strikes. The European Union called the conflict greatly concerning and urged restraint, with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen separately noting, after Khamenei's death was confirmed, that with Khamenei gone, there may be renewed hope for the people of Iran. NATO said it was closely watching the situation and that its missile defense vigilance was heightened to protect member states. Oman, whose mediation efforts were bypassed, expressed dismay. But the regional dynamics are perhaps the most consequential. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, both of which had previously committed only to intercepting Iranian missiles while denying offensive use of their airspace and basing, issued statements after Iran's retaliatory strikes on their territory, signaling a new willingness to respond directly. Saudi Arabia stated that it will take all necessary measures to defend its security and protect its territory, citizens and residents, including with the option of responding to the aggression. The UAE made similar statements. This is significant. It means that two of the most powerful Gulf Arab states may be preparing to enter the conflict on the side of the United States and Israel, dramatically expanding the scope of what is already a regional war. The economic consequences are also beginning to bite. Oil prices spiked sharply when markets opened on Monday, as investors processed the reality of a war involving Iran, a major oil producer, and the Persian Gulf, through which a significant portion of the world's petroleum supply flows. Iran claimed to have closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of global oil supply passes. Maritime expert Sal Mercogliano noted on social media platform X that while the strait technically remained physically open, commercial maritime traffic had effectively stalled as shipping companies tried to obtain war risk insurance for vessels passing through the waters. The economic implications of a prolonged closure or disruption of the Strait of Hormuz are potentially enormous, affecting oil prices, supply chains, and inflation globally. Back in the United States, a YouGov poll conducted on February 28th, immediately after the strikes were announced, found that only 33% of American adults approved of the U.S. attacking Iran, while 45% disapproved. That is a significant majority of the American public expressing disapproval of the operation even in its earliest hours. President Trump responded to those numbers with characteristic defiance, posting on Truth Social that he does not care about polling and that the operation will continue until all objectives are achieved. There is also an important subplot involving a key ally, Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed that the attacks were conducted in coordination with the United States and thanked Trump publicly in a statement on social media, saying that the murderous terrorist regime must not be allowed to arm itself with nuclear weapons that would enable it to threaten all of humanity. Netanyahu echoed Trump's framing of the operation as creating conditions for the Iranian people to take their fate into their own hands, that phrase being widely interpreted as diplomatic language for the explicit goal of regime change. On March 1st, President Trump announced on Truth Social that the U.S. military had sunk 9 Iranian warships, as well as destroyed Iran's naval headquarters. Trump described the operation as knocking the crap out of Iran in subsequent comments. Let's now come back to the war powers vote, because this is the constitutional hinge point that will define how this conflict is remembered in American political history. The war powers resolution of 1973, as we discussed, requires the president to report to Congress within 48 hours of initiating hostilities and to seek authorization within 60 days or terminate the operation. Trump's legal team and Republican allies on Capitol Hill are arguing that the president's authority as commander-in-chief, combined with the imminent threat posed by Iran and the unprecedented scale of Iranian aggression toward U.S. personnel and allies over decades, fully justifies the strikes without congressional pre-authorization. They are essentially arguing that the speed and secrecy required for the operation made prior congressional authorization impractical, and that the notification of the Gang of Eight was sufficient. Democrats counter that this reasoning has no limiting principle, that it would justify virtually any military action the executive branch chose to take, rendering the constitutional requirement for congressional war declarations meaningless. They point out that in this specific case, the administration told Congress nothing about the imminent strikes, not even the Gang of Eight, until shortly before the bombs started falling. The Gang of Eight notification is reserved for the most sensitive intelligence matters, not as a substitute for democratic deliberation about going to war.